Good afternoon. Before we begin today's session, I'd like to acknowledge that our conversation is being held virtually on the lands of the Kulin Nation, and I wish to acknowledge them as traditional owners. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present, and Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. I'm dialing in from Wurundjeri and Boomerang land. I'm Melissa Bianca-Amore, the lead curator for the Conversation series, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you all to the Melbourne Art Fair. We are delighted to present the panel discussion, The Place of Criticism. The Place of Criticism is a fast-paced conversation on the slow art of considered criticism. Speakers from Australia, Hong Kong, and the United States interrogate the rigour and relevance of art criticism and its softer bedfellows within the slippery category of art writing and publishing. To moderate the panel is Dr. Una Rae, editor of Adelaide-based ArtLink magazine, established in 1981. She has worked across the Australian contemporary art sector as an academic, freelance art writer, curator, and arts manager. Her writing has been published in anthologies, catalogues, magazines, peer-reviewed journals, and news media. It is an absolute special feature for me, being one of my areas of academic discipline of the place of criticism. So thank you so much, Una Rae, and speakers today for joining me in this very wonderful conversation of discussing the rigour of what criticism means and how we can implement that within artist practices. Thank you so much, Una. Handing over to you.
Thank you very much, Melissa, for that introduction, and a very special thank you to all of our speakers who are joining us variously. As Melissa said, this has come out of conversations that have been flying through the air at Melbourne Art Fair, I have to say, and certainly we've been discussing for weeks the place of criticism from a local perspective and an international perspective. Melissa is a critic, philosopher, curator, and widely published as an art critic. She earned a Masters of Fine Arts in Art Criticism and Writing in the School of Visual Arts in New York, where she's been based for 20 years. Working there in the art sector. By contrast, I come from a regional and remote Australian perspective, and as the recently appointed editor at ArtLink, we're kind of pushing and pulling against the dialectic of centre-periphery that Melissa alluded to. I too would like to acknowledge that we're meeting here in the nexus of Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung country and the Kulin Nations, and that Naarm or Melbourne is also a cultural capital and has a generation of critical writers emerging, new writers here, including those at Un magazine and the weekly Memo Review, which was established in 2017, just to give a sense of context, because we don't have those writers and really active people engaged directly in this conversation. So I'd like to begin by handing over now to each of our speakers, who will give a very quick summary of their extraordinary careers, and we're under the pump for time, and then we'll field a series of questions. So very much happy to invite you, Brad, to take the stage.
Thank you, Una. Thank you, Melissa, for the opportunity to be here today virtually. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm beaming in also from the unceded lands of the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. My name is Brad Haylock. I'm an Associate Professor of Design in the School of Design at RMIT University here in Melbourne. I'm also an editor and publisher of an independent press called Surplus, and a past long-time board member of Un magazine, aka Un Projects. Thank you.
Thanks. Dan from...
Hi, thank you, Una and Melissa, and to everyone for the invitation to participate in this discussion. My name's Dan Fox. I'm based in New York in the USA. I'm a writer and sometimes a filmmaker, and for a very long time I was an editor and staff writer for Frieze, the British art magazine.
Thank you. Elaine.
Sorry, I just want to put myself on mute, take myself off mute, but thank you, Una, for inviting me, also Melissa. It's a real pleasure to be with you virtually. from Hong Kong, where we are trapped in our own little bubble. But I am editor and publisher of Art Asia Pacific. My very first job was working in a gallery in Hong Kong in the mid-90s, and then I ran a nonprofit in the early 2000s. And I started working on the magazine about 20 years ago. And Uli Sig, this, incredible collector of Chinese contemporary art, he said to me a few years ago, he said, "You're the only person I know whose salary has gone down in terms of the trajectory of her career." So I think that is one of the things that we could probably all relate to in the field of criticism. So anyway, thank you. That's me.
Thank you. Great. And Cassandra.
Hi, my name's Cassandra Bird. I'm currently the Associate Director of Roslan Oxley-9 Gallery in Sydney. I'm also the co-founder of Momentum, which is an international non-profit platform for time-based art located in Berlin. For the last 20 years, I've been working with artists and curators and collections from my time living between New York, Berlin, and Sydney.
And Daniel Browning.
My name's Daniel Browning. Thanks, Una, and thanks, Melissa, for the invitation. I'm currently the presenter of The Art Show on ABC Radio National. Prior to that, I presented a program called Away for about 15 years, dedicated to Indigenous art and culture. I'm a Bundjalung and Kullerli man. I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri country here in Melbourne. And I should also say I was an inaugural editor of ArtLink Indigenous, a specialist series of the specialist Contemporary Arts Journal.
Which is still running. Thank you very much, Daniel. That's a great point to make. Look, I want to ask each of you in turn, what is the key thing that you look for in art criticism, either your own efforts or the work of others? Because we want good criticism, but what does that look like? And I'll start again with you, Brad.
Thanks, Una. I think quality in art writing and art criticism includes, from my point of view, it includes but is not limited to three factors. And here I want to point to honesty of voice, to the craft of the writing itself. But most importantly, from my point of view, in some way or another, I think the best art criticism is a truth-telling procedure in the Foucauldian sense of critique.
Great, thank you. And Dan Fox.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I try not to look for too much for fear of missing something that I wouldn't have expected. But I think if I had to, if you're really sort of like pinning me down on it, I would say language, because language is, an imaginative approach to language, because this is the form that we are working in as critics. And when I say an imaginative approach to language, I don't mean flowery purple prose. I mean an attention to all the things that language can do. It's an incredible tool, and I really appreciate it when I come across writing that demonstrates a real attention to, choosing words, phrasing, pace, rhythm, all those things that can really, really evoke what it's like to see an artwork, to describe it, to articulate ideas around it. I mean, I think that's got to be really the fundamental, and, language that avoids jargon and cliche. And there's a lot of cliche in art criticism, and I appreciate it when people, avoid that and avoid the kind of echo chamber of consensus and shared, all the same reference points that everyone else is kind of talking about.
Yeah, fantastic points. We'll return to those. Elaine, for you, what's that mean? What is criticism at its best?
So for me personally, the key thing that I look for in terms of art criticism is this ability to be coherent and not to write in international art English, which I think we all know what that is. I also teach art criticism at Hong Kong Baptist University, and I make them read the essay in Triple Canopy about international art English. And while all of us can understand that essay, I mean, my students who are 3rd and 4th year students, they learn English in Hong Kong in primary and secondary school. They don't understand that essay at all. And so I emphasize to them that we strive, like when you write, you should really strive not to write in that other language. I think for, at least at Art Asia Pacific, we always, the editors and I always talk about how we don't want to just write for ourselves, that we want to write intelligently, but also accessibly, especially in a place like Asia, where there isn't this long tradition of art criticism or reading about art.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you. Daniel.
Well, I kind of look for writing that gives me an experience of an artwork. If I can't observe an artwork on my own, I want a writer to kind of open a window into that artwork. And I look for imaginative writing. I look for kind of a creative way of getting into that artwork. And, you know, lyricism too. I love lyrical writing. I love people who, it's a poetic experience oftentimes observing an artwork. Why not kind of build on that? Yeah, and anything that avoids cliche. It's hard sometimes to avoid cliche and to not speak in that international art language. Yeah, opening a window and insight. What is the writer giving me that I can't possibly have? How is this work being interpreted? And what are the credentials of the person who's kind of communicating with me? Yeah, all those things.
Yeah, great point about describing work. And I think, Dan Fox, you make a really great defense for description, because sometimes we need description, and it relates to language and the poetry of taking the person there. Cassandra, what is that for you, art criticism or good criticism?
Well, coming from the role of a gallerist in Australia, I want to see more of it.
Yeah.
You know, I want to see more art criticism, particularly in Australia. I think it'd be wonderful to have more art critics and more voices being heard, not just within the art publications that are dedicated to art, but I'd like to see more criticism, more critical voices across the mainstream media.
Great. I think we're on track. we're writing a manifesto as we speak, I'm sure. I've got some specific questions that I'd like to run past, and I'd like you each to sort of think about responding to those if you can at the as we go, but also afterwards we'll have a bit of time. So Brad, and I want to say I've really been enjoying this book very much, which I think is targeting, let's face it, who are the readers? They're definitely art writers. So here's a terrific compilation anthology that's just released. The book, Art Writing in Crisis. So you and your co-editor, Megan Paddy, and you've both written really beautiful pieces for the book as well. She's head of publications at NGV, but you've commissioned a really wide range of art writing across disciplines and purposes. But my question is, what have you learned about the methods and the craft, something some of you have touched on, of art criticism? And importantly, can it be taught, or is it all in the practice?
This is a great question. Thanks, Una. And of course, a tricky question as well. I'm an educator. I'm not an educator in the field of art criticism, but the various projects and initiatives I've been involved with over the years, I do have some opinions on this. I mean, I would firstly say that there are some aspects of art critical practice that can be taught. These include a knowledge of art history, which I would say is pretty much non-negotiable. I would say that the mechanics of writing, grammar can be taught. I think that other key aspects of art writing that are less easily taught and which are perhaps better acquired through practice include considerations of who one is as an art writer. Who am I? Who do I want to speak to? What do I want to say? So art writing for whom and how, and this aspect of the craft of art writing and speaking with an honest voice with an audience in mind, I think is really key to good art writing, as I said earlier, but indeed something that is less easily taught. And so here I would say that ecologies of art writing practice are absolutely essential. Magazines where up and coming writers can publish their work, opportunities for art writers to meet one another, more and less formal mentoring systems or practices, I think are really key. And indeed, in the book that I co-edited with Meg and Paddy, we sought to introduce contributors to one another so that over the course of the editorial process, we could connect art writers across international borders, connect established writers with emerging writers, and so forth. And so I think, again, just to emphasize, some aspects can be taught, some are perhaps best acquired through practice, and this acquisition through practice, I think, is very reliant upon strong ecologies of art writing.
Yeah, absolutely great point. Thanks, Brad. And it's something that ArtLink magazine is really dedicated to and reinforcing our role as mentors, writers, communities, editorial opportunities for a range of writers. And your book does that really effectively, I think, in creating those intergenerational networks as well. Dan Fox, you were tempted out of what you described as your recent retirement from decades of art writing and publishing, and for Frieze in particular. And you did that to contribute to Brad and Megan's book. And your poetic ennui and sharp irony gently strips the art world and the gala art fair bare. Burnout and pandemic aside, what, if any, do you think are the new frontiers for art criticism?
That's a great question. I've been mulling it over the last few days, and I think the new frontiers are the same old frontiers that, have always existed in art criticism. And if I were to try and describe what those are, this is very, very broad strokes, of course. I would say they're probably structural, technological, and practical. And the structural would be, who gets to publish, whose voice gets heard, who is represented, where it's represented, how are people paid and respected professionally for what they do. I think these are structural questions that, have existed for decades and decades in art criticism, but they only sort of kind of come to the surface, in waves, and I think that's an ongoing frontier. I think technological means the state of publishing. Whether it's what effects that social media has on criticism, or how the economics of publishing are changing for magazines, which is tied, that's a factor that's tied into a lot of changes in the art industry, as well as sort of publishing as a whole. I think that it's important not to be too kind of technologically deterministic about these sort of questions. I remember there was a lot of discussion a little while back about how, Twitter is going to, kill all art criticism, and it hasn't, and I think that, I would be very, very wary of these sorts of, big kind of pronouncements about criticism. But, certainly technological developments, whether going right back to the advent of the book and printing presses, has always been a thing that affects writers. And then finally, the practical frontier, which is just forever something that's being negotiated and explored. And, as Melissa said in her introduction at the start, criticism is a slow art, or it's an art of many speeds. There is slow criticism and there's fast criticism, and it's fine to have both. They can coexist. Art criticism isn't a puzzle that is one day going to be solved. We're not going to sort of suddenly one day arrive at this moment where that's it, we've solved art criticism, this is what it should be. It's always many things. It's always means many things to different people, and different types of voices or approaches to writing are useful in different kinds of contexts. There isn't a one size fits all kind of approach to criticism. And what kind of criticism is important to people in a given period of time shifts according to, the political weather or the social weather or the economic weather, all kinds of things, what shifts in terms of what's going on in art itself. Yeah. So yes, my answer is everything changes and nothing changes, I think, in criticism all the time.
Yeah. But I like your sense of optimism and to avoid the sort of, the absolutes. And heaven forbid we'd ever get it right, because then we really would have to stop, all of us, and stop reading.
Yeah.
Elaine, I'd like to ask you about The Long View. You started publishing Art in Asia Pacific in 1993. And I understand that's in English and in Mandarin, is that correct?
We have some of the articles in Chinese, yes.
Yeah, okay. So, and you draw on a critical mass of diverse writers, artists, subscribers and readers to do that. I wonder if there are distinct non-Western modes of art criticism. You've kind of touched on the, already in terms of language and international art English, but I wonder if there are distinct non-Western modes of art criticism that inform your audiences and your editorial work, or are we all kind of equally placed in a global art world?
Yeah, it's, I would say that there is definitely no kind of universal model of art criticism. At least that's my own opinion from where I stand situated in Hong Kong and within Asia. For us, we do have a wide range of writers, and we really try hard, but we never impose any kind of particular style of writing or discourse. We really try to let the writers have their own voice and to tell their own story, particularly from their own perspective. So, when the magazine started in the early 90s, it was a handful of academics, largely many of them based in Australia. And I think as the field kind of unfolded here in Asia, there were more and more writers from these places that could write about their own art. And that is really what we're looking for. We really shy away from any writer that kind of parachutes into a place and then tries to represent that voice. We really want something authentic, right? Because, Dan's experience will be a very different experience than someone situated in Yogyakarta, right? And we also try to have the writer, we don't say like you have to conform to this particular canon of art history. These art histories, especially in Asia and the Middle East, they're being written now, right? And so how can we understand that kind of authentic way of telling what happened, what that art means, and why that art and that artist is significant to the people within that context versus, let's say, someone in New York or London determining that. So that is why we have a wide range of writers, and we're not saying they all have to come from one particular place.
Yeah, and do you think that sort of a sensibility or way with language that's had an impact as well going outwards from Asia Pacific writers? It is.
Well, even like I said, the history of art criticism in Asia it's so new. It's not like in Europe where you've had people, theorists, art historians who have been writing about their art. I mean, it's much more like storytelling. And of course, if Dan's talking about, just how do writers make a living? I mean, that it's so new, and that in Asia, most people don't place any particular importance on art criticism because it isn't even a profession here, right? And that goes back to this idea about how do people make a living. So if you ask my students, if I say, how many of you want to be an art critic, they're a little confused. And I think that their parents would say, no way, because where can you write? There's no platform. But it's still important, I think, in terms of, I always say to my students, if nothing else, how would you write for your parents or your family members or your classmates from secondary school who have no idea why you're studying art, right? So how can we, right now, I still feel like we're in the early stages of education and just learning to even talk about art, right? So that's where we are. But when we get a piece of writing from someone who is writing in some kind of theoretical, language, Frankfurt School from, let's say, Chiang Mai, it doesn't feel, it feels, the editors and we feel like this is not necessarily a truly authentic voice. Somehow, to go back to that essay about international art English, somehow there's this unspoken rule that that's what art writing has to sound like. So the editors and we really we push back on that, and we try and ask them to really articulate it for people, for readers from where they're situated. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I'd love to see some of those writers writing for us too at ArtLink and to an Australian audience, because, that corresponds historically with the Asia Pacific Triennial launched in Brisbane back in 1993, and really starting to see the emergence of Indigenous art writers and criticism. So there's a lot of space for a lot more of that across all of our publication, or all of our structural, I suppose, systems. So thank you, and it's really lovely to have that teased out. Daniel, I'm turning to you, and I described it as your long-form radio discussion with artists, because I don't know exactly how many words you're sharing with us on a weekly basis when you speak quite intimately and extensively with artists, often in their studios. You've also been an advocate for really rigorous criticism within the community of Aboriginal art and artists. But that's true for all criticism, of course, that these are small communities, I suppose. And because of that, it's located within a social space. I think that's fair to say of all art criticism. But is critical criticism a bridge too far for many writers and broadcasters? And what's at stake? And I suppose I'd add to that, the identity of the critic is often one of the first things we question.
I mean, it can be a bridge too far, but I guess we have to be brave enough and honest enough to talk about the things that are troubling us when we look at an artwork. And I do think about trouble. I think about artwork that, kind of is transgressive in a way that, or it kind of lacks a cultural value, or it hasn't been tested culturally. And coming from my perspective, writing and talking about, Aboriginal art, in inverted commas, for a very long time, I do see things that trouble me. I do see work that, art criticism can be bent to fit my purpose, and my purpose is to test the kind of cultural value, the integrity of the work, and also the kind of positionality of the artist. What is this artist saying? And in a country where, our voice is one of the most marginalized, what people make and put forward as art is kind of like the first salvo in a dialogue. So my opinion is that when an artist makes work about our community, about the Aboriginal community, they are making work to which we must respond. We owe it to the artist, we owe it for the sake of the dialogue, to talk about that work in a broader social context. And I think all Aboriginal art has a social function. It is part of a dialogue that we are having with the country, a national conversation. And so I think artists have been allowed to get away with making work that isn't terribly good for a long time. And, you know, there's some kind of serial offenders, people whose work I just think doesn't deserve to be talked about. But then there's a lot of work that's emerging that does deserve to be talked about. And, you know, that first kind of salvo in a conversation, that opening remark deserves a response. And so building a community of writers, which we are doing, people who know the cultural value of the work is really important. And it goes to the credentials of the person writing about the work. The identity of the writer is just as important as the identity of the artist. Excuse me. So you have to vouch for who you are and what kind of credentials you have, what cultural authority you have to speak on a certain artwork. Not everything, we're all kind of limited. We can't possibly come from every remote community in the country or every urban community in the country. But, I think I've observed enough and seen enough to kind of make educated remarks about the value of work. I always think about value, integrity, and sometimes it's down to the artwork, sometimes it's down to the practice of that artist.
Yeah. So there is a lot at stake. And
there is a lot at stake.
And you're talking specifically there about black on black criticism, I suppose, Aboriginal artists and writers criticising and engaging with each other's work. I mean,
I can make very broad comments about a lot of other artists who are not black, whose work I also have questions about. I mean, I just see the role of the critic as you're the questioner. You have to ask questions on behalf of the audience, or you have to ask questions on behalf of yourself or, other writers, and really kind of challenge the artist to kind of be upfront about what this work is about, and not to kind of hide behind, form or, medium or whatever it is, the kind of the lyricism of the paper or the lyricism of the paint. Come out behind that and talk about, the deeper kind of social and sociological questions that good work, obviously will ask you, will invite an audience to respond.
Yeah, I think, good, you're back, Cassandra. I think that's absolutely true, and that sort of fiery commitment to being brave, honest, transgressive and fearless, I think that's something we should return to as well towards the end of this conversation, if we can. Cassandra, lovely to see you again. And you run what many would say is the premier high-end commercial gallery in Sydney, Rosalind Oxley 9. But you're in this space in the age of the socials and a surfeit of short-form media, although, as Dan Fox said, we don't have to worry about that. It's not going to kill art criticism. But how important is rigorous extended art criticism to the gallery and to its artists? And is there ever a direct or a perceived, I suppose these are two questions, or perceived conflict between the promotion and the cultural or critical capital of a work? So in view of being at Melbourne Art Fair and having a lot of conversations with commercial galleries from the high end to the pop-up I think it's really wonderful to have your thoughts on this.
Thank you, Una. Extended art criticism is absolutely vital to the gallery and to all of our artists, the younger artists, the emerging, as well as the more established artists. And I think many galleries feel the same on that level. A lot of our artists do receive quite a bit of sort of art reviews or criticism, mainly when they're having a museum show, an exhibition, or if their work is, say, included in biennales, which is really fantastic. But we're not seeing as much as that extended criticism coming from shows or exhibitions coming from the gallery. A lot of our shows in the gallery, we put a huge amount of detail and resources and effort to presenting very high standard of exhibitions for our artists and to give them a very good presentation of their work. And that's, for our clients, of course, but it's also to expand to our wider audience and our broader community. However, we don't always see much critical review from those exhibitions, even though often those artworks will get picked up and shown in museums later or biennales later, and then maybe they might receive a review, which of course we're absolutely thrilled about. But more importantly, having these extended deep analysis and criticism of any of our artists' works and their shows, it's super important for us to have, because that becomes an incredible instrument for us to communicate our artist practice at a deeper level. That is not the voice of the gallery. So it can't be read as being biased, and it's certainly something that we can use and communicate the practice of our artists to try and extend their career and extend their opportunity. We can say, look, this came from this voice, a critical voice, an important voice. And it's so useful. It's really something that can't be understated at all. It's interesting because when I think of my time in Berlin and New York, the level of art criticism there I felt was a much higher engagement directly with writers and commercial galleries. I felt like the role of the writer was, more inclusive and included in the VIP dinners, events, previews. The writers were right there, everyone trying to get their attention, all the gallerists and artists trying to want to get a review. And it was exciting. It's part of the ecology. The next day you'd have interns sort of scouring through papers and newspaper clippings and trying to find out if the exhibition was reviewed or featured at all. And that was really exciting. And I feel like, again, that's probably something that we don't see so much of in Australia. And I don't know if that's just been because of, we're having less openings because of COVID, and the whole world has sort of slowed down to an extent. But it would be wonderful to see that kind of activity around art criticism with commercial galleries at that base level to really push the artist practice and work together, from that level, and see some kind of criticism where a writer writes something and they have the reputation, the built reputation and the power for people to stand up and really take notice. So if they say, this artist is hot, this is the next artist, everyone stops and everyone pays attention. I think, there's a lot of room to collaborate more and, share a dialogue from that roots-based level.
Yeah, look, I think I hear what you're saying, and for any artist whose livelihoods are based on those exhibitions they have in commercial shows, and what would the value be for an artist at any stage of their career, but particularly maybe early on before they're picked up in survey shows and things, to get some really tough but good critical responsive criticism, like what Daniel, you've all called for that early in the piece, so they can maybe be called out or called to account or called to investigate and think, because effectively writing is thinking deeply about the art. Artists are thinking deeply about the art and work all the time, and there they are at the end of the day having a great show or a rat shit show, and no one, it doesn't matter which, there's no response or there's no response. So where do you go from that? And I'd like to, and also I think what Dan, you were saying about structural, it's our publishing models that ArtLink is, we're funded publicly, so we're not supposed to review commercial shows. I think there's a lot of those things that need to be cracked open now that we should be doing away with some of that. I know Memo are just opening a Sydney chapter, so you might see some more fast turnaround criticism. It's something I think that a lot of us would like to see happening more. But yeah, really great and very important. Elaine, please.
Can I just respond to Cassandra? Like, of course, I think that, it would be wonderful if there were definitely more art critics or people writing about art in mainstream publications, let alone even art publications, because you're saying that, art publications are only reviewing the biennials. But I think this ultimately is about what can these publishing outlets afford, right? So there was an editor who came into town maybe 5 years ago from LA Times. He was a longtime arts editor, and he had told this story over dinner. He was telling me that, in the 90s, there were 6 pages that he could cover with arts coverage. This is a mainstream newspaper, right? And he said today, the art section is basically only movie reviews, and he gets half a page. So I think we're really talking about what can these, because publishing is a business, everybody has to survive, even ArtsLink is supported by the government. If the government ever says, by the way, we want to cut this funding, what does it mean, right? So I think it's about what value do we put on the practice of even writing, right? Not just thinking about art, but asking someone to write it, and that person gets paid, and that, the pages are printed or the website is maintained. I mean, all these things cost money. And I think that, right now we're really in a crisis where it's so easy to do an Instagram post. And even galleries are saying, by the way, can you just do a little post about us on Instagram? And we're talking about a very short little blurb. And somehow that is more important. And I agree with you, Dan. I don't think Instagram is going to kill art writing. But there's your book. I would love to read it, Brad, about art writing in crisis. I do think it's fundamentally about how we value it. Not that that all of us here, we believe in art criticism. But literally, how do people who engage in this profession, how do they survive? It's really tough, And so, for instance, I wanted to ask, you said, can you ask a provocative question to the fellow panelists? Where does art criticism sit in an era when we, when I talk to people and I ask them, I listen to where they're reading things related to art, whether that's news or reviews, and they talk about places like Artsy or Ocula. These are platforms for selling art. I don't think of them as publications like Frieze or ArtLink. We cannot forget what the main business model of those platforms are. So people are writing more about how much something is worth, or they're reading these, little nugget-sized pieces to drive people to the website to ultimately look at, buying something. So what does that mean, not just to newspaper pages like arts editors, but also art publications in general? I really do think art publications, people say to me, why do you keep doing it, Elaine? Why? Like Elise Sig is like, why do you keep doing it? How your livelihood goes down. Of course, I believe in it. I think it's super important for all the reasons that, Cassandra, you say it's important to the gallery, and the rest of us, we're engaged in it. We're believers, right?
I think it's true. We're all believers. Thanks, Elaine.
Larger value.
Yeah. Brad, I want to jump to you and a point Elaine made there. The book is Art Writing in Crisis, Sternberg Press, but there's no italics or punctuation. So is it the art writing in crisis, or is it the emphasis on crisis? What was your thinking and what's come out of that? We don't have a lot of time, but please speak to that. And I guess that's some of it.
The title absolutely is a play on words, and Megan and I with the title are really trying to point to both the crises of art writing, but also the roles of art writing in times of persistent crisis. And I mean, if you have a look at the table of contents, you'll find that the chapters list, really it's split down the middle of art writing, the crises of art writing, and the critical role of art writing and criticism in relation to broader social questions. So Una, yeah, you've picked up on it precisely. It is intended to address both of these questions, both of which deserve more than one volume, let alone half a volume, of course. But there's a great range of chapters in there, texts from many writers that address both of these questions. I think that this discussion is really evocative. We heard from Daniel Browning about the ways in which writing can be a response to an artwork that is a first salvo, I think. And also we heard from Cassandra about the role of art writing in relation to the gallery. I think that the dialogical aspect of art practice and art writing, I think the cultural milieu doesn't sufficiently foster this kind of dialogical relationship between artists and art writers. I think it's in various ways too transactional. I mean, Dan Fox, you wrote in, amongst other, addressing many questions and topics in your chapter in our book. One of these was the frustrations that you faced as a writer contributing to this dialogue, but putting out volleys into a vacuum and often getting nothing back, and how frustrating that can be. I think I certainly don't have the answers to this, but I think that the ways in which there might be more engagement between artists and writers around the ideas and responses that writers are contributing, I think fostering more of this dialogical aspect would be wonderful. The question of how, though, maybe this is something we can together address.
Can I just add to that, Una, and that is, I guess we have to think about writing kind of electronically too, because I consider what I do on the radio to be a form of writing. I mean, I have to think about what I'm saying, and the artist similarly has to think about what they're saying. So we are electronically writing commentary about artwork and about practice. So I guess we have to kind of enlarge what we mean when we say writing. And the opportunities for people to write and to be published are so limited. Yeah, I know there's smaller kind of operations cropping up all the time, and there are catalog essays and exhibitions that happen, but there isn't that kind of nurturing of voice. No one's kind of nurturing people to be critical, because I guess in some ways galleries and artists don't want that. But actually nothing is lost. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. If you encourage this kind of critical culture, we all benefit. The artists benefit, the galleries benefit, the institutions benefit, dialogue benefits.
Yeah.
So I just think there needs to be a greater investment in voice.
Yeah. Thank you, Daniel. I think that's well put. Dan, in your essay, you talk about kind of who's valuing the writer, and of course the pandemic and the fires and these huge ecological crises that we're facing, and Black Lives Matter, and all of this sort of huge, very real tensions. Art writing, who cares about that? But you made an important point about who cares about the writer, and I wonder, the arts writer in this case, the critic, has the critic got such a bad name because it presumes a certain kind of authority of the kind of subject that we don't really like to, the old white man, Western trained, no authority. So yeah, who's valuing the writer? And is that, I think
that's a great question. I don't know who is valuing the writer. I think that there was a big shift that I noticed over the last 20 years where I think the practice of curating elbowed criticism out of the conversation a bit. And I witnessed firsthand, I feel, that many instances in which people who are dedicated just to writing were taken less seriously than those who were both writing in, official exhibition publications and wall didactics, but then were also power brokers. you know, and it just sort of seemed like the politics of power, there was some sort of shift in the politics of power. And I think that may be one, you know, possible reason around why writers aren't valued quite so much. I mean, I really hear what Elaine is saying about, you know, people saying to you, you know, that your pay has gone down, you know, over the years. You know, I don't know how people survive as art critics. It's so hard. It's so hard to make a living, and there are so many barriers. That sets up so many barriers, you know, unless you're kind of independently wealthy or you're married to someone, you know, who's really rich. It's hard to do, you know, or unless you've got, you know, a tenured academic position, it's hard to do as a full-time thing. I think, Daniel, you said something which was really great about like nurturing, and Brad too, you know, the sort of the dialogical aspect of this. You know, I think the role of editors, I mean, maybe I'm biased having been an editor, but we've got a few here in the room. So, you know, I feel everyone here will be sympathetic with this. I think, you know, the role of editors is also a nurturing one and a mentoring one. I think it's up to editors to help, you know, encourage writers of all generations, and to encourage, you know, intergenerational conversation, and to be there to help the writer feel brave enough to make that point that they want to make, that maybe they are worried that they're going to get ostracized in their social groups for making or whatever, you know, because criticism is a very social thing, and it's really nerve-wracking if you say something, to use your wording there, Daniel, you know, if you want to make trouble, you know, trouble is going to come and find you as well, and you're not going to necessarily make friends being a critic, I don't think, and that's, you know, it can be quite a lonely thing. So I think, you know, these sort of networks of mentoring and putting people in touch with each other. You know, Brad, I didn't realize you'd done that with the art writing book, and I think that's a brilliant thing that you've done, you know, to connect writers up who you know, may not have known each other before. Yeah, but as to who is valuing art criticism, I don't know. You know, everyone's a critic, aren't they, these days?
Well, that could be the problem, but I want to share an anecdote actually that was passed on to us, ArtLink, and we are at Melbourne Art Fair, along with other publications, Art Monthly Australia, Art Collector, Vault, and some independents. And it's one of the commercial dealers who has a sense of humour, but nevertheless said to us, well, what are you guys selling? Subscriptions? Which was like, well, we like to think that we're kind of providing and engaging with a platform which is about a discourse, which is a critical discourse. And by putting names and faces and people together and having great conversations, I really enjoyed talking to people throughout the art fair. And I suppose in response to Cassandra's emphatic and passionate call for art criticism, would it be too much to sort of put the hat out there to commercial galleries to encourage perhaps a bit more investment, because we're quite parallel, and really commercial galleries take huge financial risks in mounting exhibitions all the time. I mean, I know it's a real estate thing. It's expensive to have a spot at the art fair, and media partners, we just can't compete with that. But that if we had a kind of commitment to be brave, fearless, honest, all of the things that you've talked about, truth-telling, I think, Brad, you raised that, and decolonising, and there's a great essay by Maddie Clark in the book, and also there's some international perspectives. Taylor Renee Aldridge and Jessica Lynn write really powerfully about Black criticism, and it's about truth-telling. So we've got no shortage of people and writers willing to go out there, to go out on a limb if they felt that someone would catch the writer when they fell, that there was some kind of an ecological safety net. So we did have a sense of support, and that one day perhaps you would get a more rigorous piece of criticism directed to one of your artists, but the next time that, you know, there would be some swings and roundabouts. Well, we have about 6 minutes, so I'd love to get your comments each.
I wanted to just say when I was at the fair and I was talking to one of my peers, another one of the gallerists, and we were discussing this topic, he raised the point. He said, we absolutely, we need more criticism in Australia, and we were discussing it. We said the same point, we need to support the writers, and we understand that there is a lack of funds that go into that. And then he said it's quite unusual. We've got one of the biggest press companies in the world, Murdoch Press, here in Australia. Like, get them behind art, get them to support voices, give more exposure, give more airtime, share it, to try and communicate more about art. And I thought that was quite an interesting point too, just from an Australian perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been that's been a big long-term problem here.
Yeah, but it has to be just more than the Murdoch Press. I mean, we need a multiplicity of voices across various formats: electronic, written, published art criticism and broadcast art criticism. It's not just the Murdoch Press. And what I think tends to happen is when there is one voice at Murdoch, for example, that person, that critic, becomes the sole voice. In Australia, there's not an ecology. So if you have like Nicholas Rothwell writing for The Australian, he becomes the sole voice, articulating, the spirit and the heart of Aboriginal art to a wider audience. And I just think, we're at a point in history where, Black voices need to be heard on Black art, not exclusively. I want people to be writing about all kinds of art. I want to write about non-Black art, for want of a better term. So just a multiplicity of voices and many formats, distribution, many networks. That's what we really need.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah. Elaine, did you have a closing comment on that idea?
I put myself on mute again. I agree. I completely agree with Daniel that we need the more voices, the better, versus just one authority on art. My biggest fear is that art criticism is basically turning into a regurgitation of press releases. So as I said, it really goes back to how does a writer have autonomy, right? Where they can make a living doing this thing, voicing their opinion, voicing their value judgments, voicing what they see and hear, which all of you are supporting. But if they can't make a living and museums and galleries are just pushing these press releases through various PR agencies, maybe even these writers say, I give up. I have to now work for the PR firm. That's all we're getting. All we're getting, I think, increasingly are just press releases. When I read art writing, I just read press releases, and that's my biggest fear.
I think that's true, and a lot of readers turn off. I'm sure many of you have turned off a lot of that kind of writing. Dan Fox, you talk about show me the money, often large institutions who could.
Yeah, and they often don't. To be fair to commercial galleries, often commercial galleries will a better place to pay a writer to write something, and commercial galleries also advertise. They have which is a form of support for publications. It frustrates me that writers are paid less than what it costs to design a book or print a book, and the kind of the cap in hand, we'd love you to contribute, but we can only afford a small honorarium. I've heard that so many times, it just drives me mad. Why can you only afford that? If you can't afford to pay a writer, then you can't afford to make a book. You can't afford to make a catalog is my view. But I really want to echo what everyone else here is saying about, trying to sort of, advocate for a big ecology of writers and writers in broadcast, and in print and, across different platforms. Sorry.
I think that's a beautiful point, and it's a point we'll have to end on. I'm really thrilled to meet you all and hear you speak at Melbourne Art Fair as part of the Conversations program. And I hope you can all go off now and enjoy listening and watching some of those others. And we've all been so busy out there, but it's been a really brilliant couple of days to spend together and to be thinking about these things, not solving, but certainly connecting through new networks of writers. So yeah, declare this session closed. Thank you very much. See you at the fair, perhaps, a few of you, for one last goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.